Hello, this is Alexis, and today I will present 3 ways I use to turn sharply with our EUC. With sharp turns, I mean very narrow turns. For instance, when turning 360 degrees on the spot or almost. In this demonstration, I will be using a master, which weighs approximately 40 kilos with all the heads on. This is to say, these techniques can be applied to any electric unicycle, regardless of size and weight. Another consideration to make is that having a knobby tire might make these exercises a bit more difficult, but still very much doable. Today, I will present 3 different methods to turn sharply. The first method is the one I use the most, and it involves changing my foot positioning. But now, without further ado, let's get started. The first method involves repositioning the internal foot, which is the one that leads into the turn, by moving its toes towards the wheel, while at the same time readjusting the heel out towards the lateral aspect of the pedal. In this manner, when I initiate a sharp turn, I transfer my body weight into the back of the internal foot, and to aid this process, I keep the internal leg slightly straighter than the external one. Moreover, it is possible to move the upper body towards the turn, with the external arm forward and the internal arm backwards, with the thorax facing the turn, to allow for a higher degree of turning. This process can also be aided by lifting the heel of the external leg to redistribute most of the weight onto the internal back side. However, this way of turning is not the sharpest compared to the other 2, but I prefer it as it is quite fast and easy to apply. This is also the technique I use when off-roading, because I find it the most stable and safest against pedal scraping and hitting my foot on the ground, especially when riding on uneven terrains. In fact, even if the EUC will be leaning sideways with the pedals low to the ground, it would be unlikely to get the heel caught onto something like a rock and fall as a consequence. Note that with this method, if the power pads which are used to brake are placed closer to the center of the wheel instead of the back, more pressure might be necessary to be applied onto the heel of the internal foot in order to achieve a sharp turn. The second method is actuated in the opposite way of the first. Similar to a carver foot stance, having the front feet and toes turned outward, away from the wheel, whereas the heels and calves turned inwards and touching the wheel. In this way, leaning, thus switching the weight into the turn, feels straightforward and with an immediate feedback. However, my toes are usually found outside the lateral aspect of the pedals during this movement, and if I were to overlean or found an uneven ground, my front foot could touch it or get caught onto something like a rock and potentially lose my balance altogether, which is not ideal. Therefore, I use this technique mainly when I'm road riding and I need to turn sharply. For instance, when going over a bridge and there are those super sharp turns to get over it, or certain shared bike paths. In this manner, when I initiate a sharp turn, I transfer my body weight into the front of the internal foot, and to aid this process, I keep the internal leg slightly straighter than the external one. Moreover, as well as with method 1, it is possible to move the upper body towards the turn, with the external arm forward and the internal arm backwards, with the thorax facing the turn, to allow for an even higher degree of turning. This process can also be aided by lifting the heel of the external leg to redistribute most of the weight onto the internal front side. Finally, the third technique, which I think it is the best, and it is both safe and allows for very sharp turns. However, it is not as straightforward as method 1 and 2, and it needs a bit more body involvement to make it work. This time, I keep the feet parallel in relation to the wheel. I do not reposition my feet at all. I use my body instead. I move my pelvis externally while shifting my weight into the internal leg while crouching down closer to the ground. In this way, the wheel will gain momentum and tip to the side of the turn very quickly and effectively. This technique reminds me of counter-steering with a motorbike, but instead of the handlebar, there is the pelvis to counterbalance the sharp turning. This last method might take a bit more experience and practice to grasp, but it is really worth it, as some tricks can be also performed this way. In fact, it is considered a skillful technique due to the high-speed momentum that the wheel gains during the 360 turns. Moreover, as well as with method 1 and 2, it is possible to move the upper body towards the turn with the external arm forward and the internal arm backwards, with the thorax facing the turn to allow for an even higher degree of turning, as already mentioned twice. In summary, turning sharply can be daunting, and to be completely honest, doing that repeatedly, it gives me quite a headache. But a few practice sessions once in a while to keep up the exercise, I think are worth it. As a reminder, with all of these techniques, be careful with pedal scraping. It doesn't necessarily mean to fall, but it can impair our balance while turning on an EUC. We still can learn to pedal scrape as part of the ride. That's a skill too. But for this video is all. As usual, ciao ciao!